The moment they feel your emotional withdrawal, something shifts inside them in a way they cannot easily explain. To the outside world, they may still appear composed, even indifferent, but internally, a quiet storm begins to build. Because for the first time, they are no longer in control of the emotional dynamic they once dominated. The energy you used to give freely, the attention, the reassurance, the subtle availability, is no longer there. An absence, especially emotional absence, speaks louder than anything else ever could. At first, they might not fully understand what has changed. They may assume you're just busy, distracted, or temporarily distant. But as your behavior remains consistent, calm, composed, and no longer chasing, the subconscious begins to register a deeper truth. You are not reacting the way you used to. You are not seeking them out the way you once did. You are no longer overextending yourself to keep the connection alive. And this is where discomfort begins to creep in. Avoidant individuals are wired in a way that they feel safest when they are in control of closeness. When someone comes too close, they instinctively pull away to protect their sense of independence. But when that same person stops chasing, stops reacting, and begins to detach emotionally, it creates an unfamiliar experience for them. Now, instead of being the one who controls the distance, they are the one being distanced from. And that reversal can be deeply unsettling. There's a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, where they begin to question what changed, not just in you, but in themselves as well. Because your withdrawal forces them to look inward, something they are not comfortable doing. They may start replaying conversations in their mind, analyzing your tone, your responses, your energy. They try to find the moment where things shifted, the moment where they lost influence over you. And the more they think about it, the more they realize something is different. Something is missing. What they don't immediately understand is that your silence is not emptiness. It is clarity. Your distance is not punishment. It is self-respect. You have reached a point where you are no longer willing to pour energy into something that does not pour back into you. And in doing so, you have created a mirror that reflects their own emotional limitations. For the avoidant, this creates an internal conflict. On one hand, they value independence and emotional space. On the other hand, they are now experiencing a form of loss they didn't expect. Because what they once took for granted, your attention, your presence, your emotional investment, is no longer guaranteed. And when something becomes uncertain, it becomes valuable in a way it never was before. This is where the silent tension begins. They may not express it openly, but their behavior starts to shift. They become more observant, more aware of your actions, more sensitive to your absence. The energy in the connection changes, even if nothing is said out loud, because deep down they realize that something they once had control over is now slipping beyond their reach, and that realization, quiet, subtle but powerful, is the first crack in their emotional armor. As confusion sets in, the avoidant doesn't immediately react with emotion. They react with observation. Instead of rushing towards you or expressing what they feel, they take a step back. They watch. They analyze. They try to understand the shift without exposing themselves to it. Because for them, direct emotional confrontation feels risky, unpredictable, and uncomfortable. So they choose the safer route, distance. But this is not a passive distance. It is an active, internal process of studying you. They begin to notice the smallest details. The tone of your messages, the timing of your replies, the way you carry yourself in conversations, the energy you give or no longer give. They are scanning for clues, trying to decode whether your emotional withdrawal is temporary or permanent. And in doing so, they are forced into a state of awareness they usually avoid. The confusion comes from a place of losing predictability. Before, they knew how you would respond. They understood your patterns. They could anticipate your availability, your reactions, your level of emotional investment. But now, you have disrupted that pattern. You are no longer predictable. And for someone who relies on control to feel safe, unpredictability feels like instability. This shift creates a quiet tension inside them. On the surface, they may act unaffected. They may continue with their daily routines, maintain their usual demeanor, and even pretend that nothing has changed. But internally, they are processing. They are questioning. They are trying to regain a sense of control by understanding you again. However, there is a deeper layer to this observation. While they are watching you, they are also watching themselves. They start becoming aware of how they feel in your absence. They notice the silence. They notice the lack of your energy. And whether they admit it or not, your withdrawal begins to affect them in ways they didn't expect. But instead of expressing vulnerability, the avoidant often retreats further into analysis. They start building theories in their mind. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they have lost interest. Maybe they're seeing someone else. These thoughts are not always rooted in reality. They are rooted in fear. Fear of losing something they never fully acknowledged they cared about. This is where overthinking begins to replace emotional expression. Rather than saying, "I feel something changing," they stay silent and continue observing. They replay past interactions, looking for signs they might have missed. They analyze your behavior as if it holds the answer to their internal discomfort. But in truth, the answer is not in your actions. It's in their own inability to process emotional shifts directly. And the more they observe, the more they feel the gap widening. Because observation alone cannot replace connection. Watching you from a distance cannot recreate the closeness they once had. Instead, it highlights the very thing they are losing, the emotional accessibility that used to be there without effort. This is the paradox they now face. The more they try to understand you without engaging, the more disconnected they feel. The more they observe, the more they realize that something essential is missing. And yet, instead of stepping forward, they remain in that space of watching, analyzing, and waiting. Because for an avoidant, uncertainty is uncomfortable, but vulnerability is even more difficult. And so, they stay in between, caught in the quiet tension of not knowing whether to reach out or continue watching from a distance. Then comes the moment that feels sudden, almost unexpected, the return. After the silence, after the distance, after the emotional withdrawal, they reappear in your life as if nothing ever happened. A message, a call, a casual check-in, or even a simple reaction to something you posted. To the outside world, it may seem normal, but beneath the surface there is intention behind this re-entry. This is not random. This is calculated. The avoidant returns not always because they have changed, but because something within them has been triggered. Your distance has disrupted their emotional equilibrium. They no longer feel certain about your presence, and when something becomes uncertain, the human mind seeks to regain clarity. For the avoidant, that clarity often comes in the form of testing. So they return, not to fully reconnect, but to see if the door is still open. This is where the test begins. They don't come back with overwhelming emotion. They don't rush in with vulnerability or deep confession. Instead, they return in a controlled, measured way. Just enough presence to be noticed. Just enough engagement to provoke a response. Because what they are really asking, without asking, is, do I still have access to you? Their reappearance may feel subtle. It may feel casual, but the energy behind it is not casual at all. They are watching how quickly you respond. They are noticing the tone of your reply. They are evaluating whether you still carry the same emotional availability you once did. Because in their mind, your reaction is the evidence they need to determine whether they still hold a place in your emotional world. But here's the deeper truth. This return is not about love alone. It is about validation. Avoidant individuals often struggle with internal uncertainty, even if they don't show it. Your attention used to provide them with a sense of stability, even if they didn't openly acknowledge it. And now, in your absence, that stability is missing. So they return to test whether they can still receive that sense of emotional grounding from you. At this stage, they are not fully committed to reconnecting. Instead, they are experimenting. They send a message, wait, for your response, and analyze your reaction. If you respond quickly and warmly, it reassures them that the connection still exists. If you respond with distance or indifference, it creates tension, and that tension can either pull them closer or push them further away. This is the push and pull dynamic that defines so much of avoidant behavior. They approach, then retreat, they engage, then withdraw. Not always because they want to play games, but because they are, internally, trying to balance two opposing forces, the desire for connection and the fear of losing independence. And when they return to test you, they are also testing themselves. They are trying to see how they feel when they reconnect. They are observing whether the emotional distance has made them feel relieved, or whether it has created a sense of loss. Your response becomes the mirror through which they evaluate their own emotional state. But what they are really hoping for, whether consciously or unconsciously, is to find that you are still the same, still available, still responsive, still willing to engage the way you once did. Because that would restore the sense of control they feel they lost. It would give them the reassurance that nothing truly changed. However, if you respond differently, if you remain calm, composed, and emotionally grounded, it disrupts their expectations. It shows them that you are no longer operating from the same place. And in that moment, their test begins to fail, because the real test was never just about whether you would respond. It was about whether you would return to who you used to be. And if you don't, they are forced to face the reality that something has shifted far beyond their control. As the connection continues to unfold, the avoidant doesn't rely on direct conversations to understand your place in their life. Instead, they begin to test you through emotion. How push and pull. This is not always obvious, but it is intentional. One moment, they show interest, replying faster, engaging more, giving you a glimpse of warmth. And just when you begin to feel that connection again, they pull back. They become distant, quiet, or less responsive. This back and forth is not random. It is a way for them to measure you. What they are really trying to determine is simple. How much do you still care? But instead of asking directly, they create scenarios where your reaction reveals the answer. When they pull away, they watch to see if you chase. When they come closer, they observe how quickly you respond. Every action you take becomes data in their mind, and every reaction helps them understand whether you are still emotionally attached to them. This push and pull creates a subtle but powerful tension. For someone who once invested heavily, it can feel confusing. You might start to question the dynamic. Why are they warm one day and distant the next? But for the avoidant, this behavior serves a purpose. It helps them feel safe while still testing the boundaries of the connection. They want closeness, but only in controlled doses. They want reassurance, but without feeling overwhelmed by it. During this phase, your reactions matter more than your words. If you respond with urgency, if you try to chase, if you over-explain or overextend yourself, it gives them the reassurance they are looking for. It tells them that they still hold emotional influence over you. But if you remain calm, grounded, and unaffected by their distance, it creates uncertainty within them. Because now they are no longer sure how much control they have. This is where emotional discipline becomes powerful. Because the avoidant is not just testing your availability. They are testing your stability. They are watching to see whether you will fall back into old pattern, or whether you have truly changed. And the moment they feel that you are no longer reacting the way you used to, something shifts inside them. Their push-pull behavior is rooted in their internal conflict. They crave connection, yet they fear losing their independence. So instead of choosing one, they oscillate between both. They come closer when they feel safe, and they pull away when things start to feel too intense. But in doing so, they create an environment where the other person is constantly being tested without ever being told. What they don't realize is that this testing process can only work if the other person is still emotionally available in the same way. The moment you begin to withdraw your emotional energy, when you no longer overreact, overgive, or overpursue, the dynamic begins to change. Their tests start to lose power, and that is when they begin to notice something unexpected. Their usual patterns are no longer producing the same results. The distance they create no longer triggers panic. The warmth they show no longer guarantees attachment. The push no longer results in a chase, and the pull no longer leads to emotional overinvestment. This is the silent realization they begin to face. Your reactions are no longer predictable, and without predictable reactions, their ability to test and measure your attachment weakens. This creates discomfort within them because now they are no longer in control of the emotional rhythm. So they push again, hoping for a reaction. They pull again, expecting a response. But if you remain steady, if you stay composed, grounded, and emotionally centered, their entire testing mechanism starts to collapse. Because in the end, the push-pull dynamic is not just about behavior, it's about control. And when you stop giving them the reactions they expect, you take that control back without saying a word. As the dynamic continues, something subtle but powerful begins to emerge. Subtle signs of jealousy and indirect behavior. The avoidant may not openly express their feelings, but that doesn't mean they are unaffected by your shift. In fact, your emotional distance can awaken something inside them that they don't fully understand or know how to handle. And instead of confronting it directly, they express it in quiet, indirect ways. They might start mentioning other people in conversations, not in an obvious or aggressive way, but in a casual, almost casual tone. They may bring up someone new, highlight interactions, or subtly reference attention they are receiving elsewhere. On the surface, it may seem harmless, but underneath, it often carries a deeper intention to observe your reaction. Because at this stage, your reaction is everything to them. If you show interest, jealousy, or emotional disturbance, it confirms that you still care. If you react strongly, it reassures them that they still hold emotional influence over you. But if you remain calm, indifferent, or unaffected, it creates a new kind of tension within them, one that they didn't anticipate. Avoidants are not always comfortable expressing vulnerability directly. So instead of saying, "I care," or "I'm affected," they may act in ways that indirectly communicate those feelings. Mentioning others, creating slight emotional distance, or behaving in ways that provoke a reaction are all subtle strategies to regain a sense of emotional balance. They are not always conscious manipulations. They are often instinctive behaviors rooted in their need to feel secure without exposing themselves too much. There may also be moments where they act distant or slightly cold after periods of closeness. This shift can feel confusing, but it is often triggered by a feeling of losing control. When they sense that you are no longer emotionally reactive in the way you used to be, they may try to reintroduce distance to see if it will pull you back in. It's a way of testing whether the connection still has emotional weight. And then there are moments where they seem to re-engage with a bit more intensity, more attention, more presence, more effort. But even this can carry an underlying motive. They are observing whether their increased attention changes your behavior, whether it draws you in, whether it makes you return to a more emotionally available version of yourself. But here's the deeper truth. Their indirect behaviors are not just about you. They are about them. When they mention others or create distance, they are also managing their own emotional discomfort. Because seeing you detach can trigger something unexpected inside them, a sense of loss, insecurity, or even fear of being replaced. However, instead of acknowledging that directly, they externalize it. They create situations that allow them to observe your response rather than confronting their own feelings head on. This allows them to stay in control while still processing what they are experiencing internally. Your role in this dynamic is crucial. If you respond with emotional reactivity, you enter their testing cycle. If you chase, you give them reassurance. But if you remain grounded, if you don't get pulled into the emotional games, they are forced to confront something they are not used to facing, your emotional independence. And this is where the real shift happens. Because your calmness in the face of their indirect behavior disrupts their expectation. Your lack of reaction sends a clear message without words. You are no longer operating from a place of need or emotional dependence. That realization can be powerful and unsettling for an avoidant, because now they are no longer able to use indirect tactics to measure your attachment. Your emotional stability becomes something they cannot easily influence. And in that moment, their subtle jealousy transforms into something deeper, not just a desire to test you, but a quiet awareness that they are no longer in control of how you feel or how you respond. Eventually, there comes a moment where everything they have been doing, watching, testing, pulling, observing, no longer works the way it used to. The avoidant is faced with a realization they have been trying to delay for as long as possible, because no matter how they approach you, no matter how they try to re-engage, something is different now. And that difference is not in them, it is in you. They begin to notice that their usual patterns no longer produce the same results. The quick replies don't excite you the way they used to. The sudden distance doesn't make you panic. The subtle return doesn't pull you back in emotionally, and the reactions they once relied on to measure your attachment are no longer there. Instead, they are met with calmness, silence, emotional balance, a version of you that no longer overextends, overgives, or overchases. This is the moment where their internal narrative starts to break. Because for a long time, they operated under the assumption that you would always be available, that no matter what happened, you would remain emotionally invested in the same way. But now, that assumption no longer holds true. And that realization forces them into a state they are not comfortable with, loss of control. What makes this moment powerful is not just your distance, but your growth. You didn't just pull away, you evolved. You didn't just stop chasing, you started valuing yourself differently. You didn't just react less, you became emotionally self-sufficient. And that transformation changes the entire dynamic, whether they admit it or not. For the avoidant, this creates a deep internal conflict. On one hand, they still feel the pull toward you. They still remember the connection, the familiarity, the comfort you once provided. But on the other hand, they are now facing a version of you that they cannot easily reach or influence, and that creates both attraction and discomfort at the same time. This is where the reality sinks in. You are no longer the same person they once had access to. The emotional door they used to walk through freely is no longer open in the same way. And the more they try to access it, the more they realize that something fundamental has changed. But here's the truth. They don't just lose you. They lose the version of you that tolerated inconsistency, the version that overgave, the version that stayed no matter how little they invested. And that loss is what they feel most deeply, even if they cannot articulate it. Because what they once had was not just a person, it was access. Access to your time, your energy, your attention, your emotions. And now, that access has been revoked. Not out of anger, but out of growth. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. And in that realization, something powerful happens inside them. They are forced to confront the consequences of their own patterns. The emotional distance they created is no longer something they can control or reverse at will. It has led to a real outcome, a loss they cannot ignore. This is where respect begins to form, even if silently. Because deep down, they recognize the strength it took for you to reach this point, to detach without chaos, to walk away without begging, to remain calm in a situation where you once would have reacted differently. But at the same time, they are also faced with a difficult truth. They may have already lost their chance, not because you closed the door out of spite, but because you grew into someone who no longer needs decay. Kept that door open for validation, and that is the final realization, the one they cannot escape, that the version of you they once had access to no longer exists in the same way, and the new version of you is no longer waiting.